Okay, my name is Roger Harrabin. I work for BBC. I'm the environment analyst, which means something I've never quite worked out. I've been doing environmental stuff for 25 years. Particularly had a long-standing interest in transport and in cities and air pollution and climate change and stuff. So this is meat and drink to me. But I'm going to read a bit. I didn't write this script. I'm just going to read a bit from the script. It says here, is the autonomous electric car the future of urban transport? We are on the cusp of an automotive revolution. Sales of electric cars are growing faster than petrol and diesel, etc., etc. At the same time, money is being poured into autonomous driving technology. This revolution has profound implications for urban design, including less space needed for parking, greater priority for pedestrians and cyclists, better air quality, and automotive batteries can also be used for smoothing out peaks and troughs in energy supply while they're not in use, okay? And what I would say to that script is, yes, all those things would happen if the revolution takes place. And I know there are some differing views amongst our panel as to whether we will see this revolution or not. Certainly it seems to be just out there on the horizon. Everyone seems to be talking about it. There seems to be a certain sense of inevitability about it. But I'm not quite sure whether A, it's inevitable. I've worked in newspapers a long time before I joined the BBC. And I know that the very same newspapers that will be pressing the driverless vehicle revolution, as soon as one driverless vehicle hits a child, they will become the child killer cars, and nobody will look at the macro statistics looking at how much safer they are than people like me driving cars with poor eyesight. So I'm really not personally certain that the revolution will go ahead, and I'm not quite sure how we plan cities for a revolution that might or might not happen. But anyway, these guys are far better informed on this than I am, so hopefully they'll offer some sensible suggestions. First up is Miles Tite, who's Professor of Transport, Energy and Environment at the University of Birmingham.
Thank you very much. I'm just really going to start off with a few thoughts which might help to generate some discussion later on. I'm not sure where I stand in terms of whether or not the revolution is going to come, and I'm not sure I'm necessarily going to be around still if it does come to actually see it. But if it does come, I kind of have mixed feelings about it. I can see there are some amazing positives that might arise from having widespread use of electronic autonomous vehicles, particularly in our urban areas. But I can also see there are some massive problems and some difficulties which we're going to have to overcome if this revolution is actually going to happen. And I think the scale and the extent of these problems depends very much on how the system actually works and how the system is set up, and particularly how we plan it. And over what period we actually plan the changes to occur. And that's something I think which is very unclear. We're all talking about autonomous vehicles at the moment, but the plan for them is quite vague, and that makes it very difficult to be precise to say, well, yeah, this is going to happen and that's going to happen. On the positive side, I think there is potential for safety improvements. There is potential for increased efficiencies of vehicles and therefore reduced emissions, which we hear a lot about at the moment. But most importantly, I think there's huge potential for greater equity in terms of transportation. So if we set this up right, if we get it to work, then more people should have more access to vehicles and to travel around our urban areas and elsewhere. One of the things I'm not sure about is the ownership model which is being proposed for autonomous vehicles. Will the vehicles be privately owned, or will they be in some kind of public ownership? So essentially a kind of personalised public transport. And I think that's quite important because it defines who has access to them, who can use them, how easily we can afford them, and so on and so forth. And if we get the pricing right, then actually we could see a much more equitable use and availability of those vehicles, opening up travel to people for whom it's quite difficult at the moment, the elderly, for example, children. Will we let children use these vehicles? Interesting question. And are all the vehicles the same? Is there going to be a kind of Richard Branson model vehicle, which is, huge and all singing and all dancing, and then the kind of vehicle that I might use, a small sort of single pod? Or are they kind of a universal design? Certainly in terms of making the system work, a universal design I think would be much more easy. The transition process I think is quite important. How do we move from where we are now in our current transport system to this revolution, this transport system of the future? And how are we going to deal with the different stages in that transition, moving from almost zero autonomous vehicles through slowly over a number of years to perhaps much higher proportions of autonomous vehicles in the vehicle population. And I think to ensure that all stages of that transition go smoothly, we need to understand how that process is actually going to work. More generally, I think there's an issue of how the vehicles will interact with the other players in the road environment, in particular pedestrians and cyclists, which is one of my particular interests. What will the power relationships between autonomous vehicles and vulnerable road users, walkers and cyclists actually be? Will they be the same as they are at the moment, or will it change? There's all sorts of interesting ways in which it could play out. For example, if we have an autonomous vehicle which is designed to stop when a pedestrian walks out in front of it, which is one of the things which is being proposed, then I guess we might find some people in our population who delight in the fact that they can jump out in front of vehicles and stop them, or they can walk down the middle of the road and make the vehicles go at their speeds. So there's some interesting and difficult decisions we have to make. To make it work, I think the designers will have to build in a level of aggression into the vehicles in order that they can actually persuade the pedestrians and others not to get in their way. But that, of course, means that you're kind of playing God to a certain extent, because you will inevitably kill some pedestrians. So someone is going to have to take an ethical or moral decision as to how many we're willing to cope with, willing to sacrifice to these vehicles. But otherwise, they'll go at walking speed, I suspect. And lastly, is a future based on autonomous vehicles something we really want? And I don't think we've necessarily had that discussion as a society. It seems to be happening, and it seems to be being driven by technology and by companies that are seeking to make a profit from this kind of development. So it may be something that society is not that keen on. And it has some interesting issues in terms of sort of other developments going on in transport at the moment. We have a health agenda which is trying to push and promote active travel, and yet autonomous vehicles will go against that. There'll be an opportunity for us to walk and cycle and be active less because we can easily get these vehicles to use for all our journeys. So.
Thank you. Just stay there a second. I just want to raise a few of the points you've raised, because I have thought about that power relationship one before, and it seems to me that you've kind of blithely skated through it, really, but there's some really deep ethical issues involved here, and I'm not sure that society has the capacity to actually make those decisions. I'm wondering what forum they would be made in. So, for instance, let's suppose, say my wife is having an affair, she gets into the driverless vehicle and goes off to see her lover. Now, as far as I know, this is this is a fictional scenario I have to explain. My wife's not in the audience, but just in case she has any friends. As far as I know, she's not having an affair, but let's suppose she did, and she's driving off to see her lover. All I have to do is just stand in front of her car, and she can never go. And that ability is granted to anybody. I don't know if anybody's driven through parts of South London, where it seems to me that pedestrians will deliberately not look at you and walk straight into the road on a pedestrian crossing, or even not on a pedestrian crossing, and you jam on your brakes because you don't want to kill them, and you might get a good kicking if you did do anything to them anyway. There are parts of the world where drivers who hit pedestrians are lynched. And this gives a much greater power to those people who just might want randomly. Let's just suppose some head case decides that he will spend the day, let's go, 2 mates go. You're out on the lash, you're at university, it's Freshers' Week, you've had 10 pints, let's go and spend 3 hours standing in front of cars. I mean, how are we going to get through this?
Well, exactly. You need a system which has some kind of level of aggression in it, so that the pedestrian
has permission to kill. Okay, you're the minister now. Okay, I'm the journalist. So, Minister, you're giving permission to kill.
Well, I can imagine.
Autonomous vehicles, permission to kill. How many are you going to kill?
It's a decision you have to make. I mean, we make that decision implicitly at the moment.
We do make it implicitly, but I can't see a way in which we can make it explicitly. Because you're the minister, and I'm asking you, how many people are you willing to kill?
I certainly don't think there will be a manual which kind of says, well, the minister signs off at the bottom and says, well, 20 people this year is fine. But those are the sorts of decisions we make about transport. We do it at the moment in terms of, we have, 2,000 deaths every year on our roads or something in this country. There is a tolerance. It's the price of mobility. We
didn't make it up. The difference is the system has grown up to be like that. The difference with autonomous vehicles is we will be making it like that.
Sure.
So we will be explicitly making those choices of how many should live or die. I suspect we're not going to get through that debate.
No, it is an inevitable choice I think you have to make. Now, whether you make it explicitly and you make it obvious, or whether you kind of hide it somewhere in the background, remains to be seen, I suspect. But it's a very difficult thing to say. I mean, the argument you might say is that it's going to be safer than what we currently have at the moment. Therefore, it's a good thing, even if we are going to kill 500 people.
So it would be okay to kill 500, would it? That would be okay,
it's better than 2,000, I suppose. So, I mean, I don't propose to make that decision. I think it'd be a horrible decision to make.
Okay, let's just try the audience on this. Put your hand up if you feel comfortable with autonomous vehicles being granted what we're calling a degree of aggression. So if a pedestrian appears to be taking the mickey standing in front of you, that you can mow them down. And this would result in a certain number of deaths per year, but we're going to kind of debate how many that should be. How many of you feel comfortable with that? Fantastic. What a brutal lot. How many do you think? Call out a number. How many do you think should die on the streets every year? Okay, it's going to be, this gentleman's suggesting a £500 fine for jaywalkers, which would be one interesting way around it. I guess if all the streets were policed by cameras, then the cameras, you'd just like a match of the day, you could see whether the pedestrian had willfully stepped out or not. That would be a way, wouldn't it? Anyway, look, thank you very much.
Thank you.
We've established that this isn't straightforward, and that's been a very, very interesting little interview with the minister to be there. So our next participant is John Lamont, who's Chief Executive of Transport for Greater Manchester. Actually, John, before you start on your pre-arranged preamble, could you just give us your thoughts on willfully allowing deaths from autonomous vehicles? Just give us your thoughts on that as an appointed official.
So I think no one politically is going to sign up to a set number of deaths. Everyone is going to look at the safety argument and say, what is the safest alternative? Because everyone is going to look at the road safety casualties and say, how can we reduce them? And if this happens to be a good method of doing it, then people are going to look at it as a sound option. I just wanted to start, if I may, I think it's helpful to separate the issues out. One of them is around who or what is driving the car. A second one is what is powering the car, and that's really around, is it electric, is it petrol, or is it something else? And the third one is, so how many people are in the car? And that's really starting to get into the debate of car sharing, and is that the right way ahead? And then I think there are three, and there might well be more, policy objectives that this might be wanting to address. One is congestion. And I come from an area that's about the second worst in the country for congestion. And we need to find a way of dealing with that. Second one that's most obvious is we need to reduce our use of fossil fuels. And again, from my patch, we're due to try and reduce our use of CO2 by something like 48% from 1990 levels by 2020. And at the moment, we're going to miss it. So we need to do something. And the third one is probably about improving the quality of life. And I include in that sort of the air quality aspects, levels of stress, connecting people who are otherwise left out by the transport network. So what would it need to make it work? And I'd suggest that it needs national government to have a strategic framework, because otherwise we'll do what the railways did 180 years ago, and we'll have different gauges, and we'll work to different time zones, and that cannot be. So it needs a national framework. it needs local government to get behind it in terms of their planning. Otherwise, it will not work. And that's connecting housing, planning, environment, everything else. And the third one is that operators of public transport need to incorporate it in their thinking rather than just challenging it. Because the Uber revolution should tell us, if nothing else, that you cannot just sit and watch this. What would make it fail? What would make it fail is if everyone who currently has a car gets an autonomous vehicle. Because a one-for-one replacement will not solve the congestion issues. It's going to have to be about sharing. And that leads me to the challenge. The challenge is, it's all about behaviors. It's about people being prepared to get in a vehicle that they don't have control of and accept that they're going to have trust in it. It's about people being prepared to share their vehicle routinely. It's about people still wanting to accommodate active travel, walking, cycling in their day of life, in their way of life, so they achieve the health objects. It's not impossible, but it will be challenging. Thank you.
Thank you. You've laid out some hurdles there. What likelihood is there, do you think, that in, say, the next, what are we now, 2017, say by 2030, what's your feeling about the way we will have gone by then?
I think you only need to look at, well, most of us probably came here on Docklands Light Railway. We've seen autonomous, sort of, in this case, heavy rail type solutions in there. We know that it can work. We're happy to do that. So I think we can be more comfortable with the idea of it. And if you go to Sion at the moment, where they've got autonomous buses operating 12 to 15 seaters, they're working and everyone's going to have a look at it. I think the examples that we're starting to see in Milton Keynes and Coventry will give us confidence, and probably a bit like the internet in 1991, suddenly it was all new. Now it's, well, we take it for granted, don't we? I think it will come in. I think entrepreneurs will come in, whether it's Google or whoever else, and it will happen. The biggest challenge for us is, accepting it and getting on with it and leading it rather than waiting for it to happen.
Okay, thank you. While we're just shuffling around, I'll tell you a brief story that I heard many years ago when I was working on Thames News. For those of you who are going back on the Jubilee line, the new extension for the Jubilee line apparently was supposed to be run by autonomous trains, driverless trains, just like the DLR is. But the unions kicked up a fuss on safety grounds, and eventually the management had to concede that they would put drivers on the trains. Before then, they had actually got those glass doors. You know, the glass doors on the new section of the Jubilee line. You may wonder why the glass doors don't directly line up with the internal doors on the tubes. And that apparently was because the drivers simply weren't as accurate as the computer. The computer was totally accurate, and once they put drivers on, they had to remake all the doors on the stations on the Jubilee line in order to accommodate humans doing it instead of computers. Anyway, that's a slight aside. That's a huge aside. We're now going to hear from David Nelson, who's head of design at Foster & Partners, and we're moving now into, let's suppose there isn't a revolution, kind of what does this do to cities?
Hello? Does that work? Good afternoon. I think I'm not quite sure who invented the concept of driverless vehicles. It just seemed to appear one day, and now we're all talking about it. I think what fascinates me is the synergies or the climate that surrounds all the debate that's going on at the moment. I mean, I think fundamentally it's electric. Nobody's talking about driverless petrol cars, so the premise is that it's an electric vehicle right there and then. And I think that's also reinforced by the air quality. Everybody's got the message now that diesel was going to kill you. Yeah, diesel was wonderful before for the environment, now it's going to kill you. So basically, there's a whole psychological change thinking about, is electric vehicles really going to be possible? Cost is another massive issue. If young people today who can't afford a house, really thinking about other ways of living and indeed working, a car would be their largest expenditure. And if anybody runs the maths on that, you just don't do it, particularly if you live in a central city, preferring to use Uber, which would be much cheaper. So the idea of using cost as a driver in this thing, and the development, which is already happening, of a kind of a sharing economy is around. Aging is another one. In car insurance terms, it's the young and the old who seem to have most of the accidents. And obviously, with care and all those issues, mobility in older age is very, very important. And everybody's looking to this wonderful potential future. And the final thing to throw on it is that word called smart. Everybody's heard about smart cities. And everybody's trying to get to a proper definition of what it is. It basically means everything works on this. And if it doesn't work on this, it ain't smart. So therefore, all the information that can be gathered and pushed out there is all dependent on this. And that's the climate in which this driverless conversation is going. But if you take a slightly little bigger picture, just look away from the individual motorist and think about the big things like deliveries. In our office in London, we're about 1,000 people. Every month, we have 3,500 private parcels delivered to our office. Nothing to do with the office, it's just for the people in the office. So delivery is a real critical thing. The other thing is we live, particularly in London here, in a 19th century city. So buildings are 100, 150 years old. They need a lot of maintenance and a lot of care. And also with the value shooting up, everybody wants to knock things around. So one of the massive impacts on transportation in London is obviously maintenance and all the builders. And there's a similar story for its aging infrastructure as well. And the fixed dimensions, driverless vehicles are not going to change the width of Oxford Street or Regent Street. That's built and it's going to stay. And over the years, we've been gradually clogging the arteries. As we get bigger, the cars get bigger. And I was trying to remember the other day, we used to be able to drive down a street with cars parked on both sides, and you could move freely on both lanes. It must mean the Ford Anglia or something was an awful lot narrower than cars today. You can't do that. You have to stop, wait for those guys to come, and then you go. And then the dustbin lorry. The dustbin lorry comes right in the middle of you, and you're completely stuffed, you know? You just have to wait until those guys load the bins up. And for dustbin lorry, read food and furniture and everything else. It just doesn't actually work. And bikes. For me, there's just a fundamental problem in cities where there's a guy in this sort of several-ton vehicle where the flesh is on the inside and the armor is on the outside, right next to somebody who the flesh is on the outside and they're sitting on the metalwork. And it just seems to be a very, very fundamental thing, and it needs a complete rethink. I don't think we'll be able to rely on government. And you can make of that what you will, but I think probably their complication in this subject matter, if it ever takes off, will be to do with legislation. That will probably slow the progress down. The real movers and shakers are going to be the young people, those entrepreneurs, the young entrepreneurs. If they can see an angle with this technology, think of Deliveroo, think of all those kind of things, Uber itself. They're the ones who are going to shape our future. And maybe finally, the first level of autonomy might be trialled in the suburbs, where there's more space. And already there are things like driverless parking about to be trialled in Germany, and the idea that we were proposing to do with driverless charging may also be not too far ahead.
Thank you. Tell me what do you think driverless vehicles does for the way we use our cities? Let's suppose we do get the revolution. What does it do for the way we use our cities? And the way ultimately the way cities look, does it change cities or do they look the same?
I think it's an interesting question. I think for the
Sorry, let me just move you behind the mic a bit. Yeah.
For the large part, I think it's going to look the same. We might be, some of us are old enough can remember walking out into the street and there being no cellulose paint there. Now it's automatic. Nobody can remember a street without cars. So clearly, if it's driverless and we have the quantum reduced massively, which is what the predictions suggest, then there could be less cars in the street parked.
So councils could seize back road space and that could be used for something else?
It could
play football or whatever it might be?
Yeah, it could be used for more landscaping, bring more greenery back into the trees. That green trees like eating CO2, so maybe that would be a balancing act. That could happen.
And what about, you mentioned fat cars. I mean, would you ban fat cars? Should we make all driverless vehicles, should we make them skinny vehicles?
I think it needs, on our 19th century and medieval cities, when you go back and look at them, it really needs a complete rethink. If you go to a place like Japan, for example, they seem to have put the dustbin lorries in the photocopier and shrunk them down so they fit the streets. The Route Master was originally probably the only vehicle designed for London streets.
30 foot long and 10 foot wide.
Sorry?
30 foot long and 10 foot wide,
yeah.
According to the Flinders and Swan song.
Exactly. So,
behind that monarch of the road, observer of the highway code.
Yeah, but
30 foot long and 10 foot wide.
But the streets haven't changed their width, that's the point. And how many other vehicles are designed for the London streets? And if we don't, we've only got certain size arteries.
Well, you mentioned the Japanese. Of course, for a long time, and I don't know if they still have it, they used to have a regulation and taxation was based on the width of a vehicle. And the Americans complained because all American vehicles are fat and they couldn't sell into Japan because they couldn't pass Japan's rules about skinny vehicles. But actually that's quite rational because Japan has narrow streets too.
Yeah, and I think when America has wide streets, America's main cities outside of New York and the east and the west coasts are designed for the car. If you design for the car, you end up with highways and you end up with a lot of suburbia. It doesn't work in the city.
Thank you. Okay. Last person up is Rachel Skinner from Parsons Brinckerhoff. She's Vice President of the Institution of Civil Engineers, so she may have some hardware solutions for us, I guess. Actually, I tell you what, just to put everybody through the same ringer, offer your own view on how many people you'd be willing to slay every year in order to make autonomous vehicles realistic.
I think I'm with John on this one. I think it's all about looking in the round at what the current situation already is and what the real data actually tells us, not just in the generic blanket sense, but in terms of our major routes, in terms of city centres, in terms of suburbs and so on. The stats are all there for us to see in terms of how many people we do in fact kill and seriously injure as well every year. If we can come up with a solution which is better at all of those different levels and in total, then in the grand scheme of things, it would seem to make sense that it's something you'd want to work towards.
What about the very interesting case we had put, in which I'm trying to lure you on to talk about, in which, you know, if we don't give autonomous cars a degree of aggression about them, then people will just be able to stand in front of them all day. What are you going to do about that?
To some extent, hold that thought because I actually want to come on to it in just a moment. But however, no, because actually there is something important to say there. I think again, this isn't about thinking about all roads in future as being exactly the same things. Now we have motorways where you do not have pedestrians, you do not have cyclists, you do not have tractors. All these different things are already managed. So I can see that you would end up with a very different type of vehicle behaviour on routes like that to, for example, the city centre scenario you're describing, where actually you might want something that's very much slower. Overall, it might not be such an advantage to stand there kind of thinking, oh, I'll just stand here all day, because actually, really, what's in it for anybody in the grand scheme of things if, in fact, A, the number of vehicles coming through is reduced, and B, they're not actually going that fast in the first place anyway, because it's not designed as a place for those vehicles as the primary users. It's actually a place for people.
So you might hit somebody at 10 miles an hour if they wouldn't get out of the way, but it'd just give them a bit of a bruising.
There is a lot of data to say that if you, the stats directly suggest that vehicles travelling at more than 30 miles an hour are the ones that do the most damage. I'm not suggesting for a minute that you would bring it down to just 29, 28, but certainly by the time you get down to walking pace and slightly above, it's a very different scenario. Yeah.
Okay, or wrap them in foam, maybe. Anyway, I'll leave you with what you were going to say.
Sure. Well, you've stolen the end of what I was going to say, but that's fine. Right, so I'm going to take a sort of a slightly long-range view and perhaps be a little bit provocative and very positive about what we could get from the transition that lies ahead of us in terms of connected and autonomous vehicles. So my premise basically is to say that these vehicles are coming, and they will be transformational. And in fact, this isn't a transition that's starting today. This is something we've been doing for 30 years. We just heard about the DLR. We've had driverless trains for 30 years already in operation. And in terms of vehicle technology on the roads, we've had, you know, all sorts of braking technologies coming in. We've had all sorts of different things, cruise control and so on. A lot of those have been in place for decades, and we don't question them. It's just called assisted driving now. And what we're talking about really is just the next few steps in that journey. Importantly, I think these changes are going to affect not just the vehicles, and I think it's all types of vehicles there. I think there is a place for small pod-type vehicles. There's clearly a place for larger bus-type vehicles. There's clearly a place for freight also in all of this autonomous change that's coming forward. So there's a vehicle change, there's lots of route-based change, and there's place-based change. So I guess maybe I just challenge what we just heard there in terms of not much change to the streetscapes. I think it could be quite large. I guess really the question for all of us is, do we want to treat this as a threat or as an opportunity in terms of the changes that we have ahead? We don't know everything. We can't possibly. This is innovation territory, so by definition there's a whole load of unknowns, and we don't even know necessarily what is 2 or 3 steps ahead, let alone 10 steps ahead. But what we can do is think about what we might want in the end. So on the basis, I guess, that you're sort of with me in the glass half full territory, there might be something in all of this. I would agree, first of all, with some of the big drivers of change that we're seeing in this mobility sector right now. We've heard most of these already. I think absolutely there's a trend towards more driverless operation. I think separate to that, there's a trend towards connected operation, which is subtly different. It's about how the vehicles are interacting with each other, not just the fact that they can move on their own in themselves. I think absolutely there is an electric trend going on, and I think exactly as we just heard, the diesel-based issues high profile in the media recently are pushing us faster towards that level of change. And finally, I think I would put the sharing piece, as we just heard, into that bucket as well, because I think often this is a slightly neglected quarter, if you like, of these different trends, and it's something that actually, if we got that right, that could be really, really transformational in terms of the way that we actually use and move our vehicles. It turns the whole thing from a system of private cars versus public transport into something which is far more collective and collaborative in the round. So overall, what do we want? We want something better than today. We want something that's popular, and that goes to the public trust point, and we want something that is fair, I would have said, and fair in the sense of being affordable and available to all, and possibly having a greater availability than we do at the moment. So probably this isn't an entirely market-led solution, and I would totally endorse what we've been hearing in terms of the public sector, both national and local government involvement here, because I think actually what we need is that policy and strategy steer from that angle, coupled with the private sector involvement, both in terms of the fleet providers, the technology providers, but also developers and landowners and regeneration specialists on who, between them, are the ones who actually make and shape future places. So I think there's two big things here. I think there are changes to come in terms of the routes. Very briefly, the key point here is that as and when we get to a fully autonomous solution, the vehicles can move themselves. At the moment, every vehicle requires a driver of some sort. It's kind of a legal thing. Clearly, in future, we are going to start to see a decoupling of that. So the trip end, where the vehicle starts and stops, does not have to be where the person starts and stops. That opens up all kinds of interesting stuff to do with placemaking and the way that we might park vehicles, where we might put vehicles that aren't in use, and indeed how we might share them. Secondly, the whole of the road network becomes much more of a system across both national and local networks. It means we can actually manage things much more proactively. That is an enormous opportunity because it's the one thing that road network operators at all scales cannot do today. They simply have to deal with essentially what is there in front of them and try to manage as best they can to manage congestion and so on through various levers and tools. But in the grand scheme of things, it's a very, very difficult job to do. I think if we leave it to the market, we'll get something that is safer. I think we'll get something that is probably more efficient. And I think we'll start to see something which, in the round, has some marginal benefit in those senses. However, I think we get masses more out of it if we actually took this more collaborative approach across public and private sector. I think that's where we get the real safety and efficiency benefits. It's where you certainly start to tap up the reduced congestion angle. It's where you start to talk about the integration with walking and cycling and public transport and all those different pieces. Because actually, if you manage it as one single system instead of competing systems, you can actually start to pull the right levers to make the changes. That's partly made possible by data. We are able to do things now, today, that we absolutely could not have done 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago. It's why we have such blunt instruments to pay for our roads today, to do with fuel tax and basically, the car tax that you pay every single year. We could, if we were feeling really ambitious, and in terms of turning a sort of public interest point of view and a participation point of view, we could move much more towards a user pays principle in terms of our road network. We could have it so that different trips are priced differently, and you are actively making a choice between a future autonomous vehicle trip that looks rather like a car and a future autonomous bus trip or a future autonomous rail trip. There are all kinds of tunes we could play on that in terms of actually creating a system that works for everybody and is probably safer, cheaper, faster, et cetera, than everything we have today. The other main point, I guess, that I touched on there in answering Roger's question is around the changes to places. Something I've been thinking about quite a lot is different types of places and what sort of changes we could bring through. So really briefly, if you look at a new regeneration area, you have the chance now, because these things take 10 or 20 years to actually deliver on the ground in practice, to plan for these vehicles and think about actually how do we put the streets together in order to make much more efficient use of space, to create greater value for the developers and indeed the public sector if they actually get involved and are partners in that process. There's evidence to suggest that you could get as much as 15 to 20% more productive land use out of a site like that if it's developed at scale today than you could have done, say, 20 years ago. It's a huge benefit in terms of that regeneration angle. Existing urban spaces, it's terrifying to think that at the moment between 30 and 45% of trips circulating within some of our urban centres actually are just people looking for parking spaces. It's completely ridiculous when you think about it. That's actually a lot of the reason for a lot of our urban congestion. So there are lots of different ways you can actually put this together differently. I think there are bits of land you can take back from some of our urban spaces in time once these different vehicles come into play. And I think they could be put to all kinds of uses, as we just heard. But I think there are also much more productive uses and economic arguments for actually doing things that stimulate growth in those areas as well. Suburbs. At the moment, to be perfectly honest, it's often just another word for a sort of a suburban car park, isn't it? We park our cars, on average, 80% of the time, they're parked outside our houses. It's a completely ridiculous thing if you think about it. It's a depreciating asset that we're paying to buy, tax, fuel, insure, et cetera, et cetera. When you think about it in that context, why do we want to live in a place that's got cars littered around all over it? We could change that. Coming on to sort of major routes, there's evidence now, and it's been backed up by some of the latest government studies here, to suggest that you can get around about 40% extra capacity out of a major route if it is fully connected. And when you move to fully autonomous operation, you can get as much as 3 or 4 times as much out of the same amount of road space as you do today. That opens up all kinds of questions about what else you might do with that space, or how you might allow it to have much greater headroom in future to cater for future demand. Finally, rural areas. Totally different business case, but we have major issues with access and mobility in some of our rural areas, particularly the ones that are badly served by public transport now. It's not affordable to think we're going to suddenly fix that, so why not think about how we might use these kinds of solutions to actually change those spaces and provide a solution that is actually accessible to everybody on a sort of a fleet basis around, key villages, that kind of thing, and it could all knit together in a sort of a jigsaw pattern in order to provide access to some of the major centres, opening up new job opportunities, opening up healthcare, opening up all these different things that are currently incredibly difficult. So I guess in conclusion, what I'm trying to say is I think we have a really rare opportunity, and I think the time to take it is absolutely right now. We need to think about how we get to the best tailored outcomes for all these different types of routes and places, and by tailored I mean they're all unique. There isn't a one-size-fits-all answer here. We can be much more proactive in how we manage the network. We can use this transition as a source of new revenue, and potentially we could also use it as a way to generate brand new growth. What's not to like?
Thank you very much. You've obviously put a bit of work into this
Just
one.
a bit.
Jobs.
Yep.
What are we going to do with the thousands and thousands of unskilled people who will be out of jobs, the sort of people who will typically go into cabbying?
Sure. So we do have a lot of people who currently drive in some way, shape or form for a living. And that is the nature of our society as we have it today. If you were to roll back the clock 100 years, you would see a very different landscape in terms of that sort of particular type of role and that kind of thing. And I think what we're going to see is another roll forward and an evolution of that. So I think if you look back in history at the way that technology change in particular has brought through new opportunities, actually on balance it tends to create new jobs. It doesn't tend to take them away. They won't be the same as the jobs we've got today, but there'll be potentially more of them as we all become much more productive.
But still you often get, I agree with the general principle, and
Yeah.
that's basic economics, but there is still a class of people that get left behind. We've seen from what happened with the Trump vote and with Brexit that
Sure.
People don't want to be left behind.
Yeah, I guess, coming down to more of a sort of a nuts and bolts level of it, I think the other thing is that just because something is driverless doesn't mean it doesn't have anyone employed by it. The DLR, it is a driverless train in the sort of pure sense of the word, but there is still a member of staff on every one of the vehicles. So it doesn't necessarily mean that there aren't any roles for anybody in any of that space. I think it's much more just about actually thinking about what can people do. You could take that down to the level of light vans. So vans are the largest growth class, if you like, in terms of different types of vehicles on our roads right now, particularly in our urban centres, because of all the city logistics and so on, growth that's going on. What if the person actually driving the van didn't have to drive the van all day? What if that person was still involved with that van in some ways, but was actually doing something that was useful and productive while the vehicle was moving, as well as when it actually reaches its destination? I think we've just got to get a bit creative about thinking about what it is we're actually doing.
Okay, the ideas on data creative, of course, and it's self-evident that if you get cars linked up digitally, then you can get more cars on a motorway or more cars
absolutely.
on a road. What happens when the Russians hack the system and decide to bring the motorways to a halt?
So I think there is clearly a very big security question in all of this. There's a data security issue, and there's a system security issue in the whole thing. And I think that is no different, really, to these similar issues that are emerging all over society right now. We are really, really reliant on data, aren't we, right now? We've already given away far more data than we realise. The fact that, everybody's got a smartphone in their pocket today, we've already given away our location, where we've been, and all the rest of it.
Are you reassuring us here or making us more scared?
Sorry? Making more scared. No, I think in the grand scheme of things, we have to just recognise, I think, that the world that we are living in already and what we have already accepted. We aren't going from zero on sharing information about what we currently do to something. We already share an awful lot of that information. You think about, CCTV systems already in place, the number plate recognition systems, as I say, the smartphone data that we all share. Anybody who's using Google Maps or City Mapper or you name it, what you're doing is you're sharing your data, basically, in terms of saying, I don't want to go from here to here, thank you very much. So, yes, it is different. Yes, it is more explicit and maybe a bit more exposed. But in the grand scheme of things, I think that security side of things will actually be something that we are able to take care of in the round. And I don't think it's an issue that's purely linked to this mobility side of things.
Okay,
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Let me come to the audience. Comments or questions? Let me take three. So the lady at the back was first with her hand up, and then these two men here. Let's take 3 questions or comments. Please say your name, what you do, and please be brief because we don't have a great deal of time.
Okay, Maria Hanrahan, Chartered Surveyor. I just have a question for the panel. How comfortable do we feel about the fact that driverless car initiatives are being led in the main by companies like Uber? You've mentioned that there are a lot of ethical questions around this, and Uber are quite a self-serving company paying very little tax or no tax in the UK, and are being dragged kicking and screaming towards giving their drivers the basic living wage. So how comfortable do we feel with this issue being placed in their hands, given the ethical questions surrounding it?
Okay, well, they won't have to pay their drivers, so there won't be any arguments about wages, will there? So the two gentlemen here, sorry, that was just being facetious. We'll get a serious answer to that in a minute. Yes, sir, please.
My name's Andre Howard. I'm just a general person.
Sorry, hold the mic right up.
I'm just a general person. What two issues?
Do you have a name you could share?
Andre Howard.
Thank you.
Yeah. 2 issues I see locally everywhere in South London. School times, millions of mums in cars jamming up the roads, and supermarkets, people getting cabs to get their shopping home. Now, obviously, a lot of the small pods would be much better, but will it ever be cost effective enough to do?
Indeed. So the gentleman behind you, I think it was?
Yeah, my name's David Britton. I'm a carpenter builder. The one question I would overall with technology is that we haven't ever thought about if it fails completely, utterly. You may know that there was a system of solar flares that could occur that could wipe out our whole systems. It happened in Canada. And there's just this total reliance on believing that our systems are fail-proof. We don't have to worry about Russians. We just have to think about the natural realms of solar flares. If anybody knows anything about it, that is.
So what happened in Canada? I couldn't quite hear that.
Do you know what I mean by solar flares?
I do know what a solar flare
Well,
is, yes.
solar flares could wipe out our technology. It happened in Canada a few years ago. Nobody knows about it, really, on the whole. Most people don't even know what I'm talking about,
Okay,
I expect.
I didn't know there'd been one in Canada. Okay, who's going to deal? I think probably, as you were such an evangelist, Rachel, you can deal with the idea of a solar flare or any major incident bringing the entire country to a standstill. I tried it with the Russians, and by the way, if Mr. Putin is in the audience, it's only a joke, sir, really only a joke. So,
Yep.
catastrophe.
So in overall terms, system failure side of things, we don't tend to design these systems nowadays as a kind of an on-off type of thing. There are all kinds of levels that are built in and fail-safes and so on, so that, if everything is working perfectly, then this is how it works, and then it sort of steps down from there as and when things do actually go wrong, which inevitably they do. I think that this would be no different in the grand scheme of things. The amount of money that's being invested by all of the vehicle manufacturers and lots of technology firms in order to do exactly that is something that would do its best, I guess, to guard against all eventualities. I mean, I suppose there's never going to be a case where we could say, this will never fail. But in the grand scheme of things, I suppose, in terms of our transport network, what we're dealing with here is people moving around within vehicles. What happens if the whole thing fails? Well, it stops until such time as it works again, I suppose. Very much, I suppose, like cars frankly do today when they break down.
Okay, thank you. So, Miles, you raise moral issues. What about this issue of leaving control with private firms to bring ideas forward? I think you were keen on more of a state solution.
Well, yeah, I have the same worries I think the speaker had on that issue. It does seem to be driven and pushed forward by technology and by other big companies at the moment. And that has a number of problems. One is, I think, you potentially end up with no standardized system and the things don't actually fit together and maybe it doesn't work particularly properly. But I would like to see some kind of overall perspective by some sort of government regulatory body which thinks through the issues and actually starts to put in place a number of restrictions, I guess, on how these new systems are developed and how they will actually work.
So what would you restrict?
I mean, I think, well, firstly, there's a sort of technology side. I think you need to get consistency of approach. You know, if you're talking about widths of vehicles and things like that, then you need to have some kind of standards for that. So they are going to fit on a typical road and they are going to be able to drive down certain sorts of routes. But then you get all sorts of regulations in terms of how it's actually going to operate. Is it going to be the sort of pseudo-public transport system? Is it going to be a private ownership system? And how's that going to work? And what do we actually want? And it seems to me we should have that debate. We should actually, you know, nationally think about those kind of issues and think about the future we really like, because we have an opportunity. I think, as Rachel has said, you know, there is an opening that we could create something a lot better than what we have at the moment in terms of transport. But we need to think about what that is and what we want it to be.
One question strikes me. Where would you start? Would you start with one-person mini taxis to take the minimum space on the road and create least havoc? Or on the grounds that they're more safe than ordinary vehicles, would you start with buses? Because you'd save more people, but then you'd kill more if there were to be a freak accident. What would you do?
I think what...
Sorry, I am paid to ask these questions.
No, that's fine. I think what will happen is probably there will be a focus on public transport vehicles. So I think buses, we will start to see greater dependence on autonomous use. I think the companies that are developing it, the Googles and the Ubers and so on, are also hopefully getting into these kind of mini pods, and you see them in Milton Keynes and places like that, starting to be developed on our roads. And I suspect there's going to be a sort of parallel development along those lines, but it seems to me the public transport side is probably the easiest place to start, because there are fewer operators and there are fewer people involved in running that sort of system.
No. Okay, thank you. I think we've taken as read that the people want to get mums and kids out of their cars on the school run time and the supermarket shopping run. I think we can take that as read from all the panel. Let me take some more questions or comments from people. There's a gentleman at the front here. Any more after that? Okay, sir.
Auburn Thurston, Merton Power. I'd like to have another little kind of nibble and worry. Sorry, can you hear that?
Yes.
Better. Auburn Thurston, Merton Power. Another little kind of nibble and worry at the soft issues that around employment, displacement of jobs, etc., that Roger mentioned 5 or so minutes ago. Perhaps I'd like to invite people, members of the panel who haven't spoken about that, to give some thoughts. Are we going to have kind of Luddite riots from, black cab geezers from Gants Hill and cabbies, etc., and courier drivers?
So, John, I mean, in Manchester, could you see Manchester buses, for instance, becoming driverless?
Yeah, I think.
And what would be the implications for your union's reactions if that were to happen?
Well, this is why I made the point about the need for operators, for example, bus operators, to kind of embrace this technology rather than see it as a challenge. Because then I think the idea of the autonomous buses could be incorporated rather than it be seen as a challenge and head-to-head. I look in Manchester at the moment at the way Uber's come in, and we haven't had the sort of challenge between black cabs and Uber. I can't say that that's anything we've necessarily engineered, but actually, if you talk to the black cab operators at the moment, they would say that their patronage has increased despite the number of Uber users. And I think that's just a reflection of, people want to move, people want to travel, they will make most use of these things. But I think biggest thing is if people work together from public, private sector, from operators, we've got the best chance of making it work.
Does that mean you don't fear the employment consequences?
I think it will naturally change and diversify as technology comes in, and we're pretty much one of the hearts of the Industrial Revolution. We've seen this sort of thing happen in various different industries. Things just change, things change around it. People's jobs change. We change the nature of what people do, and we have in Manchester. That's the way we evolve.
Yeah, we're going to need more border guards when we get Brexit. There's plenty of jobs there. David, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think there's a word around which called disruptive. And I suppose if you're sitting in a nice, comfortable office with your latte and your laptop open, that word sounds kind of chic, you know. For somebody who's going to be about to losing their job, it's not very chic at all. And I think disruptive means disruptive. And I'm a avid black cab user. I use them every day on the way home. And I use Uber in California because there's no other way of doing it. But in London I do that, and I speak to the guys quite often. And they all are full of hard-edged information about how TfL have allowed so many licenses in London, and probably unlike Manchester, they're not very happy about it at all. Many of them we hear are actually going to be moving out of the black cab world very soon because they don't see a future. The last guy I saw was going to become a mobile dog shearer.
Mobile dog shearer.
And he felt that
perhaps he can get an automated vehicle and he can shear the dog in the back when he's going from one client to the next.
But I think the sad thing, maybe 5-10 years, the black cabs will probably at best be a tourist attraction.
Yeah.
And somebody will, when they start to diminish and disappear too rapidly, some noble person will stand up. And the inevitable thing will be it'll be a heritage ride in central London or something.
Yeah, like the rickshaw guys at the moment who charge 96 quid to go for 5 minutes.
Probably what we're staring in the face.
Okay. Any mobile dog shearers in the audience? No, I thought not. Any other comments or thoughts? Down the front here, please. And I'm sorry, sir, I just missed you, but we'll come to you in a second. So one from here and then one from back there, and I think then we're going to have to wrap.
Hi, hello? Yes.
Yep, we got you.
So my name's Kigre. I just do some research for landscape architecture practice. My question's on the issue of legal liability. So we've established that there is this whole ethical quandary around how these cars would be programmed to act, and in many cases these protocols will have to make decisions on not necessarily avoiding danger or consequence, but on what kind of outcomes are less bad. So how many people is an incident going to hurt, and like how severely or whatnot. And essentially what I'm asking is, who do you think will how will this change the kind of liability implications of car accidents, and how will people take responsibility for what happens in these car accidents when their outcomes are pre-programmed by certain individuals, whether they're in the public sector or the private sector?
Thank you very much. Very good question. Let's get the microphone to the man at the back there. This one just here. If you could be very brief, sir, because we're coming to winding up time.
My name's Sean Tofts and I work in planning policy. I just wondered what your view was of the future arguments against development in the countryside with electrical, renewable transport available to all throughout the country, and that should probably be economically viable for everybody. At the moment, the planning system is based on the whole presumption of sustainable development. If everywhere is now sustainable to develop, what safeguards will be in place to stop urban sprawl?
Yes, I mean, there is a very long argument that is that if cars stop polluting and if they stop causing accidents, then there is no barrier under the current system of barriers for us to develop everywhere and to travel an infinite amount of time every day. The only barrier would be the amount of time it would take us. It's an interesting point. It's got a challenge for the future. Who can pick up that one? I think David, is good on that one.
I think it is interesting, the last point about the effect on the countryside and the greenbelt and everything that we've been talking about. In some of the internal discussions we were having on various projects, we suddenly got a sudden worry that probably all this new technology would enable the suburbs, would actually provide a greater mobility in the suburbs first, partly to do with the legislation. And the legislation is going to take a long time to go through because it's going to bound to be very complicated, just as moving around in cities and stopping and starting will be a great inhibitor, if you like, to that progress. But you know, if you're in the suburbs and you or out of a lower density environment like a suburb, maybe the first chance for, if it comes in, to do with autonomous driving will be secondary functions like parking. You know, there are already experiments going on in Germany in the early part of this year to do valet parking into a car park by, you drive to the car park and it parks itself. As I said in the talk, I think that with Nissan we were looking at maybe charging during the night and vehicles moving very, very slowly, and yes, would stop and start if anybody walked in front of them, but just merely going to a charge point. I think some of the things you hear about how cars could sort of go in convoy and go very fast all suggest motorways rather than cities. So you could find that the first impact, and a big impact, is to boost suburbia and actually therefore boost more development in the Greenbelt.
Rachel,
Which I don't think we would be promoting, but it could be the outcome.
a thought from you, Rachel, on the notion that you could get into your car, travel a very large distance because you can be doing your work in your car, communities then get fragmented. Transport is not a simple thing. There are many elements involved in it. It could smash communities.
I think that's exactly right. I don't think it would be in anybody's interest to end up with a system where that kind of behaviour was encouraged. It's not good for places, it's not good for people and communities, that kind of thing. I think, though, that just putting a slightly different kind of lens on it, I don't think this is about a solution where we try to stop people from moving. I think it's about rethinking what efficient, productive movement looks like. You know, we've had 20-odd years of transport policy where we've talked about, you know, trying to reduce the need to travel by car in particular, and certainly the air quality and those similar arguments have been used throughout that time as the reasoning behind it. That is going to change, and so we do need to rethink sort of how that all stacks up. But it would be a ridiculous and very perverse outcome, wouldn't it, if we ended up with a situation where people are able to travel, say, 3 hours in order to, while they're effectively doing their half a working day to go somewhere and half a working day to come back again, and so on. So I don't think that would be, as I say, I don't think that would be in anybody's interest. I guess maybe this is where that idea I touched on there in terms of turning it into sort of a user-pays system or a pay-as-you-go system might come into play, because I think it would work for the very short trips, but also those long trips as well. If you were to price trip making according to, you know, the degree to which it is actually something that you would want to encourage, you could discourage the very, very short trips that should be walk or cycle, for example, as well as discouraging the incredibly long trips by making them simply extremely expensive, frankly.
One very last point, and a quick one if you would, John. Can I come to you on this? Clearly, if you've got an autonomous bus, it hits a child and kills it, then you're responsible, your authority is responsible. What about if an ordinary punter gets in a driverless car and that hits a kid? Who's responsible then?
I think there are an awful lot of legal issues that need to be teased out on this. It's going to be the subject of debate as we go along. I think we've got to use some of the workings that are happening from Google out in the States, from Sion and other places, to see how they come up with all these legal and ethical issues, and try and get the best of both of all those experiences to work out what is the standard book of rules. But I think that's why I think that there is a role for national government in determining what that framework is, because I don't think it can be down to individual operators or suppliers to kind of do that themselves. I think it has to operate within some sort of framework.
Okay, thank you. Some really good questions there and some really good debate. The next up here is in 15 minutes. What does legislating for the well-being of future generations look like, and can it work? This is based on a Welsh lead, I think a really fascinating Welsh lead, in which people are being obliged to look to the future in their decisions that they make. But for now, this panel is over, so please can we thank the participants.